The argument in favour of euthanasia or assisted suicide is often presented in terms of choice, and it is argued that the current state of affairs denies people, those people who would wish to end their lives, it denies them the right to exercise their choice. Whereas people who, for whatever reason, are opposed to euthanasia, they are in effect, it's said, imposing their value system on others. So a law change is presented as a win-win situation, and proponents of a law change, proponents of euthanasia would say, well, if you don't want to use it, you don't have to. So that way, everybody gets to exercise their choice. And it's a powerful argument. Our society values choice and indeed, I think, exonerates it above other values. But I think it's also a very naive position to take, because our choices are always made in particular contexts. They are also shaped by the context in which we live, and above all, they are limited by the context in which we live. So the question for me is not just about choice. Society limits people's choices in all sorts of ways for the good of the individual or for the good of society as a whole. So the question is whether, in the case of euthanasia, is this an instance where society, the government, has a right to limit people's choice in that area? I think unequivocally that it is. As I said before, choices are always made in a particular context. And if you look at what's happening in New Zealand, particularly if you consider what's happening to our older people, there's a longitudinal study which has been carried out in Auckland which shows that of those people 65 years and older who live in the community on their own, more than 50% of them are lonely or severely lonely. And of that amount, 9% are severely lonely. And when you look through other countries in the Western world in particular, it's a growing phenomenon. The social isolation of the elderly is a growing problem, and we know that social isolation and loneliness are contributors to depression, are contributors to poorer health outcomes, and are also contributors to people wanting to actually end their lives. So I think there's never been a more dangerous time to consider a euthanasia law in our country. The biggest fear for me is that older people will come to see themselves as a burden. If you look at the newspaper reports and the discussions which occur from time to time around the cost of healthcare, and we know that our healthcare system is operating under severe constraints. The discussions around the elderly, and we know that the numbers of older people are growing, the discussions around the elderly are always around the cost of that care, how much it's going to cost financially, but also in terms of the emotional costs to caregivers, whether that's family or others. And in that environment, I think it's a very real risk that older people will come to see themselves as a burden. They won't want to put their children or their family or their caregivers or even the country through that cost. And it is a fact, I think, that we are seeing the elderly more and more in negative terms. It's what I would call ageism. The elderly and becoming old is becoming less and less valued in our society, and in that context I think bringing in a euthanasia law is like mixing fire and petrol. I think Jesus in his ministry showed that he cared deeply about those who were on the margins of society, whether they were people who were sick or whether they were people who were politically alienated or culturally alienated. So his whole life, as I understand it, could be summarised by, in the first instance, yes, his love, his perfect love for the Father, but also his love for his disciples and for all the people that he met. And secondly, I think in terms of a preferential option for the poor, for those who are most vulnerable. And that is a part of our gospel tradition. And when you look at who are the most vulnerable in our society today, it is those people with disabilities. It is those people who are older, who may find themselves on their own, who are increasingly becoming socially isolated. So if Jesus were here today, and if he was seeking out those who are most vulnerable, I think he would be seeking out and talking to those people in particular who have disabilities and who are elderly, and he would be wanting to show care for them and include them. My big fear about a law which brings in euthanasia is that it will make us a less inclusive, a less loving and a less caring society, and as has often been said, the mark of a caring society is the way in which it cares for those who are most vulnerable.